Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, but stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. I forgot to unplug the phone, and you know how that's going to happen. Somebody's going to call and try to offer me an extended warranty on my truck. Or they're going to want to sell me some insurance, or maybe it's that prince from Ethiopia again. Coming into the home stretch, it's Australia in first place, followed close behind by Ghana, Africa. Canada has dropped back to third place, with Norway closing fast. Romania is holding at fourth, with Mexico and India neck and neck in fifth. New Zealand is kind of limping along behind the pack. I've said this before. The United Kingdom is made up of 4 countries. If I chopped their stats into fourths, they would be back there with New Zealand. What do y'all think? Should I put UK in the race, or should I just leave them out of it? Send me a note. Let me know. Your votes will be counted, and whichever side wins may put the UK in the race. Just a quick public service announcement. If somebody calls you from some big company, like say the electric company or the cable company, and they offer you some money-saving discounts, it's probably a scam. Big companies don't need to attract your business by calling you. You have to call them. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. If you do get a call and you think that just maybe it's legitimate, just tell the person on the phone you're going to hang up and call the company back. Chances are when you do call the company, they'll tell you they're not offering any kind of discounts like that. Just a thing to keep in the back of your mind. Remember, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. On another note, if the ocean levels are rising like they keep telling us, how come Plymouth Rock is still visible? Something to think about. I started out putting together a show on the Zone of Silence after meeting Dario Benique at the Wonderland UFO Festival. He wrote a book called The Zone of Silence, which you can get at Amazon.com. I got this in the mail yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to read very much of it. It's a book of poetry, and I'm not into poetry, but I like these. They're worth reading. He wrote he wrote a poem about a ghost, and he's written a couple other poems, one about the Zone of Silence, as the cover implies. Check it out. Remember, books make good presents. Anyway, the information I could find on the zone wasn't quite enough to fill an hour without going over the same thing twice. To round out the hour, I included stories of UFO activity in the same area of Mexico. Once I'd read all the information on all 3 incidents, I discovered that they're all connected to the Zone of Silence. Anytime I start working on a show, I find all kinds of side roads as well as connections to things I didn't know I'd find. I find my research is as much of an adventure as I care to have. Francisco Sarabia Tinoco was born July 3rd, 1900, in Ciudad Lerdo. I was going to say Laredo. It's Lerdo, a town located in Durango. He was the sixth child of Santiago Sarabia and Maria Tinoco. At age 14, Sarabia settled in Texas and he entered the Mexican State College, where he earned a bachelor's degree. In 1919, he moved to Kansas and he joined the Sweeney Automotive School, where he became a mechanic. Not finding work as a mechanic, Sarabia began working in the circus as an acrobat. At some point in his career, he took an airplane ride. Now, this is back when very few people ever got to fly. Seeing the ground from above, he discovered that his real passion in life was to be a pilot. So he went to work at the Chicago Aeronautical Service. He worked on the ground crew as a mechanic until he was able to learn enough about pilots to take the test. Then he became a pilot. In 1930, he returned to Mexico and he settled in Morelia, Michoacan. Sarabia formed the Southern Aeronautical Company, flying tobacco from farms to factories. He also transported food that would spoil if it had to wait for a truck, moving things over the mountains. Politicians would hire him to fly them around the country. His plane was named El Conquistador de Cielo, Conqueror of the Sky. He'd installed an extra-large gas tank so he could cover more ground, not having to worry about finding an airport with facilities. As he flew around the country, he began to think about how rapid transport would improve things for everyone. Sarabia began to plot out new routes to get from one part of the country to another, as well as new crossing points to fly into the United States. On one trip in 1930, Sarabia was flying from Durango to Coahuila, changing the names of cities in Mexico, Coahuila, when something went wrong. He was over the desert when all of his instruments went haywire. His compass was spinning and his altimeter was going up and down. He attempted to contact the tower and his radio wasn't working. All he could hear was silence. This was long before there were radar stations anywhere. If a pilot got lost, he was on his own. Sarabia had to use his experience as a pilot to fly by what is known as dead reckoning. He knew where he'd come from. He hadn't made any dramatic changes in course. He knew how far he had to go to get to his destination. So, pretty much using guesswork, he was hoping he knew where he was. He picked a point on the horizon and flew to it. He flew over more desert in Coahuila. Finally, his radio began to work. All the instruments came back on. Once on the ground, he told people at the airport about this bizarre experience. Air travel was scarce in Mexico, and as far as has been reported, no other pilots flew over this part of Mexico. Later, 1964, a Pemex engineer, Harry de la Peña, was surveying the desert in a quest to run an oil pipeline to Jimenez, Chihuahua. During his expedition, he encountered a dead or a silent zone that affected his radio communications. The crews relied on radios to communicate with the workers as well as with the base. It was De La Peña who described the area as the zone of silence. Since then, the term has stuck and it has been used by everybody. Having taken great interest in this radio anomaly, De La Peña went back to the zone several times in an attempt to repeat the phenomena. What he discovered was that the dead zone was not a fixed area. It would expand and contract. He wanted to know why. What was causing this area to be completely silent of all radio communications? What would make it bigger or smaller? As scientists and local observers discovered there was about a 30 square mile area of land within the zone that seemed to attract meteorites. Two meteorites actually hit the same spot, one in 1938 and the second one in 1954. Locals also tell of the night 1969 when there was a huge meteorite explosion that lit up the night sky, broke windows in their homes, and produced an absolutely deafening explosion. Why are so many meteors drawn to this one location? For generations, stories have abounded from in and around the zone, encounters with strange beings, unusual lights in the sky, and an overabundance of meteor showers. These usually come from people living on the remote ranches or outsiders who have gotten lost in the desert. People have seen fireballs in the sky, and at times they see what look like flames rolling down the side of the mountain like a massive burning tumbleweed. Physical traces of these nocturnal visitors can be found. One witness returned one morning to the site where he'd seen mysterious lights the night before, and he found that the scrub vegetation had been burned. Dozens of similar reports emerge from the zone, told by what is reported as reliable witnesses. People have encountered aliens that are known as the Nordics. Ranchers tell about being visited by beings who would show up out of nowhere. They would have no provisions, and they were all dressed the same. Those who've encountered the tall, fair-haired aliens say that these individuals spoke perfect Spanish. They only asked for water, and they disappeared without leaving any footprints. When asked where they had come from, the Nordics would say, "From above." Ruben Lopez was driving through the zone to visit a relative of his in Ceballos. As he made his way across the desert, his engine began to run rough. Now, this was no place to have engine trouble. Up ahead, Ruben spotted a group of people on the side of the road. As he got closer, he could see there were 5 what looked like very short men, all dressed in shiny one-piece suits. They all had round helmets on their heads. Ruben stopped next to the men and he looked at them. His engine was barely running. As he sat there looking at these men, they all faded from view. That's when his engine suddenly started to run smooth again. He had no idea who or what these beings were, but he thought they had some connection to his engine trouble. I wonder what would happen if you drove a Tesla into the zone of silence. Would it just conk out? July 1970, the United States Air Force was working on a new missile and rockets at White Sands Missile Base. A missile goes in whichever direction you fire it, like throwing a rock. A rocket can be guided by either onboard controls or remote control. The Lockheed Martin Athena rocket was launched into the sky. It flew south. The rocket was supposed to crash into the desert in New Mexico. Instead, it continued flying south, crossing the border. The boys in the white lab coat could only watch as the rocket flew into Mexico. This was bad, but it wasn't that unheard of. Anytime a missile or rocket crossed the border, the Air Force was allowed to cross over and retrieve it. Things were a lot different back then. The Mexican economy slumped in the late 70s and early 80s, causing millions to head north looking for work. By 1986, an estimated 3.2 million illegal aliens were living in the U.S. The war on drugs, launched by Richard Nixon in 1971, also focused attention on the southern border, which would become the main conduit for cocaine and marijuana. Anytime the government declares war on something, you know it only means more taxes and less actual action. The war on drugs has been dragging on for 50 years, and it's still nowhere near a solution. The war on poverty was declared in 1964, and people are still living in less than conditions. The government is not the solution. Communities are, but you're not here to listen to that. The lost Athena rocket was carrying two small containers of cobalt 57. This made things a bit worse. Radioactive substances were now possibly scattered about the Mexican desert. A bunch of U.S. airmen drove into Coahuila Desert. There was no such thing as GPS. No satellite looking down from above showing a rocket splattered in the desert. The men had to drive around in the middle of nowhere until they spotted the wreckage. As they drove, they discovered their compasses began to spin around, making navigation a lot harder. With the sun up, you can figure out which direction is south by where the sun is and what time it is. At night, you have to get your bearings. This has nothing to do with round steel balls. You get your bearings by finding the Big Dipper. Once you know where the Big Dipper is, you follow the two stars at the cup end of the constellation, and it points you to the Little Dipper. The last star in the handle is Polaris, the North Star. No, you're not getting your dippers. The Big and Little Dipper are also called Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, or the Big and Little Bear. You're getting your bearings. Some folks say I'm full of knowledge, and other people just say I'm full of it. I learned this at Fort Knox while learning how to be a tanker. Once they found their missing rocket, they tried to report in. None of the radios would work. The rocket was nowhere near any kind of a road or even a trail. In order to get a bunch of trucks to the crash site, a road had to be put in. If you've never driven in the desert, sometimes the ground is so bad you'll have a flat tire every couple of miles. Plus, you might get stuck in the sand if you find a soft spot. Bulldozers and earth-moving equipment had to be brought in. The airmen grabbed as much debris as they could, loaded it onto their trucks, and headed north. A few of the boys in white went along to try figuring out why their rocket went astray. They took soil samples to be studied back at the base. The soil held exceptional amounts of magnetite and uranium. This just might be why the rocket lost its navigation. Werner von Braun, yes, the rocket scientist, was sent to have a look. Von Braun took reconnaissance flights in a Cessna to confirm the crash site. With the aid of about 300 workers from Mexico, a rail spur was built across the desert to the impact center. A team of Americans came and began excavating. Von Braun stayed in the area for about 28 days. The Air Force brought in temporary dormitories, labs, kitchens, medical facilities, and they set all of this up out in the desert. They even built a runway to transport cargo directly back into the United States. By rail, they hauled away tons of debris. They loaded tons of dirt. They wanted to know more about the magnetite and the uranium. Once Mexico City received the report of the unusual mineral deposits in the zone, they began sending in researchers and scientists to see what else might be found. The desert also held a lot of fossils. October 1975, a couple of fossil hunters, Ernesto and Josefina Diaz, drove into the zone of silence looking for samples and any unusual rocks that they could find. As they worked, they could see a rainstorm was heading in their direction. You are more likely to drown in the desert than to die from thirst. It's just one of those weird things. Watching the rainstorm as it came their way, the couple decided it was time to get back to the pavement. The storm caught them short of the road, and their pickup got stuck in the mud. Their choices were few: stay in the truck and hope somebody came along to help, or try walking back to the highway and try to catch a ride into town. As they sat there wondering which was the better course to follow, two men came walking out of nowhere. Both of these men were extremely tall. They both had on yellow raincoats and hats. Without saying anything, the two men got behind the tailgate and pushed. The truck came up out of the mud onto firmer ground. Ernesto was so glad to be able to drive out of the desert, he jumped out to thank the rescuers. The two men were gone, and they didn't leave any footprints. On the evening of September 1976, the people living in Ceballos were surprised to see a large object hovering in the midnight sky. They were shocked to find a light surrounding the object. Along with that, they heard a deep humming sound coming from it. Residents gathered to stare at the silent ship, estimating it to be 300 feet long. The humming was more felt than heard. Witnesses said it was rectangular with a curve at the top, and it glowed with an inner luminescence. Colored lights, white, blue, and green, were seen around the edges of this craft. Dogs howled in distress and pigs squealed. The town mayor said all the townspeople had the sensation of being watched, and they felt their skin as if it was prickly. After hovering for a few minutes, the craft started to move away. Police Chief Chaparro said that he reported the event to the authorities in Durango, but they never heard anything back. Also 1976, a person who was visiting the zone of silence took a photograph of a UFO landing near what is known as Magnetic Hill. The photo shows a shiny silver object hovering in the air. The person was able to take a few more photographs as the thing rose up, went back into the sky. Since the Athena crash in the 70s, the Mexican authorities have established a research facility in the zone of silence, which many speculate is in fact a joint facility shared by the United States Air Force. There is evidence that such things as the Trino Vertex facility, which is listed as a U.S. Air Force facility, is shared by them and the Mexican government. The Mexican authorities refer to this facility as the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve. The facility's primary function is to study the mutations among the local flora and fauna, as well as the animal population. They're also studying spatial and temporal disturbances of the human population and the land use in the Mapimi Biosphere Reserve. The people living in the vicinity of the zone of silence are the subjects of research and experiments. The zone of silence is geographically parallel with the Egyptian pyramids and the Bermuda Triangle. It is located just north of the Tropic of Cancer. Scientists at the Mexican Research Center have named the area the Sea of Thetis due to it being at the bottom of what once was an ocean millions of years ago. November 1978, journalist Luis Ramirez Reyes was visiting the Zone of Silence as part of a news team assigned to cover a story on the bizarre things going on there. Choosing to go ahead of the main team, Ramirez and his photographer drove out into the desert. The rest were going to meet them at the Biosphere. Driving around most of Mexico, they were expecting to see signs telling them where they needed to turn in order to find the location where they could meet up with the rest of their team. As they went, Lewis saw 3 men walking along the side of the road. They looked like they might have been local residents known as the Theatrio. Lewis was surprised when the driver passed these men as if they weren't there. He just sped on by. It didn't take long to figure out that they were in the middle of the desert, and they didn't know where they were. To add to this situation, they didn't have any water or food, and they sure didn't have enough gas to just keep driving around trying to get from lost to found. Reyes noticed there were 3 people walking along the road heading their direction. Hoping that these locals might be able to point them in the right direction, the journalist told the driver to slow down and talk to them. The driver looked at Lewis, and then he looked up ahead at the empty road. Lewis kept insisting there were 3 people on the side of the road and they should stop and ask for directions. The car stopped, and Lewis realized that these were the same 3 men that he'd seen earlier. Only the last time he'd seen them was miles away, and they were heading in the opposite direction. He asked the 3 men if they had seen a vehicle similar to theirs in the area. They said they had not, but they told him that if they would drive out across the desert, across the Sea of Thetis, they would reach the Biosphere. The 3 locals claimed to be out looking for stray animals of theirs, but they had no water bottles or other gear that would indicate they were able to survive in this menacing terrain. After completing the cross-country trek, both men were relieved to see the Biosphere in the distance. Upon arriving and meeting up with their team, they discussed their unusual encounter with Harry de la Peña, the same guy that had named the area. Peña told them that there were no people living in the desert other than the folks working at the Biosphere. There was nothing to feed animals, so nobody kept flocks in the area. No locals would venture into the desert without provisions. An aerial survey later that week convinced the investigator of the utter desolation of the region that stretched for hundreds of miles. Within the zone, there are plenty more unexplained findings, such as a 6-mile-long, rectangular-shaped earthen platform. A hill formation was discovered by botanists and zoologist Luis Maeda that appears to be man-made, and it's covered with stones that are not from the area. Somebody went through a lot of trouble to haul tons of stones and deposit them out in the desert. They found some ancient relics, including a human head carved from stone. Mysterious ruins that show no known link to known people of the area have been found that are estimated to be thousands of years old and are thought to have served as some sort of astronomical observatory. perhaps somehow linked with the intense meteorite activity. As of yet, nobody knows the true purpose of this ancient observatory. It is also possible that the area's magnetic aberrations have the ability to cause people to hallucinate, a phenomenon that has long been reported from there by locals and travelers alike. The extremely ancient ruins in the Zone of Silence pose another disquieting enigma of their own. Archaeologists have been unable to determine their age, but they undoubtedly form an astronomical observatory thousands of years old. There's no connection between this Mexican Stonehenge and the primitive tribes that cluster around the water holes which constitute an oasis in the region. At some point in antiquity, somebody was quite active out there in the zone. Perhaps they were interested, as are people today, in the weird things going on. A meteorite that crashed in Kahuahua. That's how it's spelled. Come on. A meteorite that crashed in Chihuahua in the late 1950s contained crystalline structures that far outdate the solar system. Researcher Luis Maeda Villalobos concluded that the meteorite contains material as old as the universe. Our solar system is something like 6 billion years old, while the meteorite's age has been estimated at 13 billion years. Kind of like how the moon is older than the Earth. Whether we're dealing with UFOs, dimensional visitors who find the magnetic aberration facilitate their journeys, or merely poorly understood part of our world with unsuspected properties, no easy answer applies to the riddle posed by the Zone of Silence. The builders of the mysterious ruined observatory would have probably agreed. There is a legend that might shine some light on the ancient site coming from the Pueblo Indians. Years ago, some say hundreds, others say thousands, a huge light was seen streaking through the sky coming down somewhere to their south. Believing this was something from the spirits, a band of Indians, feather, not dot, set out to find the location. They traveled deep into the desert. As they moved south, they encountered a group of people coming north. It took some hand gestures and confusion before the two groups were able to communicate. The people traveling north were looking for the place where a huge light had come down from above. These two bands were both looking for the same object. They both agreed that the light belonged to the spirits and was important to both their tribes. Eventually, they discovered an impact crater. The two groups built a city next to the crater. They shared the city, each continuing with their own beliefs and rituals. There's evidence that these two cultures met and traded goods. What is uncertain is whether the Pueblo Indians met up with the Aztecs or the Toltecs. Archaeologists found the remains of an ancient ball court, like what you find in South and Central America, as well as construction methods used by the Pueblo in villages. To this day, television signals cannot be received in Ceballos or the neighboring ranches. Some magnetic force with the power to dampen radio waves seems to exist in the area. And next, we'll move a little bit farther north from the Zone of Silence. At first, I thought this was all the information that the zone had to offer. On the evening of August 26, 1974, U.S. air defense radar picked up an unidentified object over the Gulf of Mexico. The unknown object was at an approximate altitude of 75,000 feet and it was traveling at 2,200 knots, or 2,530 miles an hour, on a flight path that would take it towards U.S. airspace, about 40 miles southwest of Corpus Christi, Texas. Cars and trains, which are known for shorter distance traveled, use miles per hour or kilometers per hour. Boats and planes, which often travel longer distances affected by the Earth's curvature, use knots. Knots are a more accurate way of predicting how a ship or a plane traverses the face of the Earth. That's why nautical charts include and depend on longitude and latitude measurements. Now, you know why they use knots instead of miles when you're out at sea. At first, it was thought to be a meteor, but the radar operators looked on. The object suddenly began to decelerate to 1,700 knots, or 1,900 miles an hour. The object also began to take turns. It began heading at 290 degrees. The descent was notable for how it occurred in a series of neat controlled steps, with each new altitude maintained for about 5 minutes before going lower again. This was no meteor. For those few folks who don't know, a meteor is a rock traveling through space or coming into our atmosphere. A meteorite is a rock that hits the ground. Why the change in nomenclature? The boys in the white lab coats want to keep us confused. Whatever it was leveled off at 20,000 feet and then began passing over the very southern tip of Texas. It continued for about 500 miles before disappearing at a remote, inhospitable desert area near the town of Koyami, Chihuahua, Mexico, close to the U.S.-Mexican border. This would put it about 250 miles north of the zone. It was all very strange, but it was about to get even stranger. At the same time, a small airplane with one or maybe several people on board took off from El Paso, Texas, en route to Mexico City. The records of the flight have vanished, like most documents do any time a UFO is involved. The small plane was tracked by radar as it crossed into Chihuahua, Mexico. The plane was about 300 miles from El Paso when it disappeared. At first, it was thought that both the UFO and the plane had gone below the radar and that they would appear again. They never did, and officials began to worry that there may have been a collision. This was only further exacerbated when civilian air traffic indicated that a civilian aircraft had gone down in the area and people were looking for it. The plane had originated out of Mexico, putting it out of the U.S. jurisdiction. When U.S. officials tried to offer their assistance to the Mexican military, they were pretty much told that Mexico would handle it. The Mexican authorities had immediately launched a search of the area where the plane and the unknown object had gone down. They soon found wreckage of the civilian aircraft from the air. They also found something else. There was a round craft laying on the ground near the wrecked plane. The second craft was disc-shaped, made of shiny metal. It was slightly damaged, but it didn't look in bad shape from above. The U.S. was eavesdropping on what the Mexican military was doing, and once again they called and they offered their help. And once again the Mexican authorities said, "We'll take it from here." Then all the radios went silent. A satellite and spy planes reconnaissanced over Mexico, and they continued watching as a Mexican military convoy drove to the area of the wreckage. They continued watching from above as something was loaded on the back of a truck, and then the convoy began to move out. Unwilling to take no for an answer, the U.S. military began to assemble a team to help out. Around this time, the convoy stopped moving. Things were getting weird. A 15-man team was sent from Fort Bliss, Texas, to sneak into Mexico to see what was going on. When they arrived at the crash site, they were able to find the wreckage of a small civilian plane, a Cessna 180, as well as several Mexican military vehicles. There were dead soldiers in the area. Thinking that this was a bit scary, the team called in specialists dressed in hazardous materials suits. Those things are hot, especially when you're in the desert. Those things are hot on a cold day. They began searching the area, and they found a flatbed truck with a saucer-shaped flying craft on the bed. The craft was about 16 feet in diameter. There were no doors or windows. Fearing that there might be some kind of contamination to the area, all the equipment and all of the bodies were rounded up and put in one big pile. Then the U.S. military brought in some very big helicopters. They latched onto the disc and they flew away with it. All of the dead soldiers and all their equipment was set on fire. It takes a long time to cremate a body, unless you use thermite. Use thermite and it only takes a little while. The military left, and they tried to leave the situation as if nothing had happened. Most people would say that that's pretty much the end of the story. What is known as the Koyami UFO incident. There was no more activity that anyone could find until somebody came forward with documentation. The several UFO researchers were contacted in 1992. They received mysterious documents in the mail that were titled Research Findings on the Chihuahua Desert Crash. A lot of these people were here in the United States, and some were in Europe. Leonard Stringfield was one of the researchers who received one of these packages in the mail. The package was called UFO Crash Retrievals, Search for Proof in the Halls. I'm sorry, that's the name of his book. Why do I keep calling him Richard? Leonard Stringfield wrote a book called UFO Crash Retrievals, Search for Proof in the Hall of Mirrors. He was very impressed by the documents and convinced that it was authentic, saying it was authoritatively written using correct military terminology and of note and unlike a hoax, draws a line between so-called hard evidence and that which is speculative. It is unknown where the documents originated or who sent them, making it impossible to verify as real or as hoax. Efforts were made to track down more information on the incident, and it seemed that some elderly witnesses who lived in the Koyami area remembered seeing helicopters traveling back and forth through the sky. There's no physical evidence to be found. There's a depression in the ground that looks as if it was on fire at one time. The sand is kind of melted. It takes a lot of heat to melt sand. Witnesses who lived in Presidio, Texas back in the 70s said that they recall seeing a bright flash over the Chihuahua Desert late one night. They also said that they remember seeing U.S. military helicopters flying back and forth into Mexico. The case was further propelled into the public consciousness with the release of an episode of TV show called UFO Files, which did a segment on the Mexican Roswell. It happened out over the desolate desert wasteland on that fateful day. Is this a real case of a UFO, an aircraft collision, or is it just another spooky story? February 20th, 2008, the UFO Hunters also aired a show about the crash in Koyami called A Crash and Retrieval. The UFO magazine team investigates two sightings in Mexico that were separated by 33 years. August 20th, 2007, residents in Zilitla saw an object in the sky that changed speed and direction, kind of like the Kecksburg crash, in a way that suggests it was being flown before it crashed into a nearby grove of trees. In 1974, near Koyami, is the incident known as Mexico's Roswell, where the unidentified object collided with a plane and crashed into the desert. You can find both of these shows on YouTube. Simply look for Mexican Roswell. Ruben Uriarte and Noe Torres have both been on my show. They wrote a book called Mexico's Roswell, which also deals with the Koyami crash, and they've been at several conferences where they've spoken on the subject. If you search for Ruben Uriarte and Noe Torres, Mexican Roswell, you can listen to what they have to say. It would have been a 300-mile trip back to Fort Bliss in El Paso. It is only 50 miles to the U.S.-Mexican border if a helicopter were to fly towards Presidio, Texas, which is northeast from Koyami. There's a whole lot of nothing around Presidio. You could park a fleet of military aircraft in the brush and nobody would know it. Seeing a bunch of military vehicles anywhere along the border isn't that odd. The story goes, once on our side of the river, the saucer was loaded onto a flatbed truck and hauled to a railhead. Then the saucer was shipped to the CDC for examination to see if it was dangerous before shipping it once again to Wright-Patterson Air Base. Think about this a minute. A saucer has come down from who knows where, and the first people to have contact with it died suddenly. Let's put it on a train and run it through several big cities en route to Atlanta, Georgia. What can possibly go wrong? Trains are derailed all the time. Things happen. Even when you're prepared for accidents, things go wrong. The military had no idea what had killed all the Mexican soldiers. Was it some kind of an outer space bug? Some kind of a gas, or maybe an unstoppable microbe? The government has a really bad habit of taking risks with civilians' health and well-being. They will say it's for our own good. National security. All manner of excuses to take risky action to keep us in the dark. Now, this third incident took place north of Mexico City. At around 3 a.m., there were reports of a silver object streaking across the sky over Valles, Mexico, which is 350 miles north of Mexico City. Several people witnessed the object. The closer it got to Zilitla, the more reports would state that it was an orange glowing fireball, much like the one that would eventually crash in the town. Zilitla, Mexico, 2007. Shortly after 4 a.m., August 20th, 2007, a glowing orange fireball screamed over the town, waking up everybody in the town. Those who were already outside getting ready for the day witnessed a huge ball of light flying through the sky, taking several sharp turns. The object had to have been under intelligent control. The glowing object crashed into a nearby woodland, tearing through several coffee and lemon trees. That would get my attention. It hit a coffee tree. Flares and sparks of red and orange glowing material shot in all directions, and it was followed by a loud explosion. Many of the townsfolk called the police, telling them that something had crashed near their town. It took about 30 minutes for the authorities to arrive. The first thing they did was place the town under a lockdown. Everybody was chased off the streets and told to not come out until they were told to do so. Reporters Antonio Martinez and Maribar Villalobos state that the initial report was received by Jose Angel Avalas, an officer on duty at the Centro de Control y Comando. In English, that would be the Command and Control Center, or C4 in the Army, through the 066 hotline. This report was from Ruben Velasquez, who stated that a silver object measuring 20 feet across had flown over the sky and then crashed into the San Miguel collective farm. Another witness, high school student Oscar Gonzalez Mar, a resident of the El Cedral collective farm, told the El Mañana newsroom he'd seen a shining object streaking across the sky heading towards the Gulf of Mexico at about 8 or 9 p.m. on August 19th. That was the night before the crash. He lost sight of it, not knowing whether the thing had crashed or continued flying. Nearly 2.5 hours after the San Miguel incident, Mrs. Sutranina Castillo reported to the Zilitla that an object resembling a fireball had impacted a bunch of trees in the property located near the Montoya metal shop owned by her husband, Juan Montoya, adding that the trees had all caught fire. Joaquin Hernandez was a direct witness of the sighting. He and his family were preparing zacahuil, and they lived next to where the object hit the ground. A zacahuil is referred to as the tamale of tamales, or the party tamale, because it is the biggest tamale dish ever prepared. It is usually reserved to feed big social gatherings and parties. The size of the average zacahuil measures from 3 to 4 or 5 feet long, depending on the size of the gathering. The average zacahuil can feed from 50 to 150 people. Hernandez was preparing the zacahuil batter and saw the fireball as it came down over the trees. Figuring that most people wouldn't believe him when he told them what he saw, he called for his neighbor, Juan Montoya, and his wife to come out and see the crash. He added that it was a highly unusual thing to see, as there was no thunder or storm activity that could lead anyone to think that it had been a lightning strike. The incident was reported to the Municipal Civil Protection Unit. The story goes the authorities searched the orchard trying to find what had come down and destroyed all the plants. The witnesses report once they were allowed back outside, all they could find at the crash site were some strange, long pieces of ash. This ash had a hard quality to it. It wouldn't simply crumple upon touching. Police had taken a majority of this with them following their sealing off the area. For the next several days, anybody contacting the police asking what had happened were pretty much ignored. Nothing to see here. When researchers later investigated the events, several interesting points from the local population came to light. For example, in the immediate hour following the crash, all communications were down. No radios were working, no TV sets worked. A researcher, Bill Burns, from the UFO magazine and the TV show UFO Hunters, spoke to an intelligence officer from the Central Police Intelligence Bureau. The officer wanted his identity kept secret. He didn't want the backlash that his coming forward was guaranteed to bring. Both the police and the citizens were afraid of the military intelligence unit. The anonymous officer said that numerous reports came in that evening of something in the skies above Mexico. After the incident, the officer wrote up his report and sent it to the intelligence unit. Following his submission, the report vanished, as did a majority of the strange ash found at the site. Researchers theorized that the ash like substance could be a result of intense heat and high electrical pulse fusing together wires and metal. The electrical pulse would have contributed to the communications problems immediately following the explosion. It would appear, whatever the object was, it had arrived in Zilitla via a strange part of Mexico known as the Zone of Silence. This bizarre patch of land sits within the Chihuahua Desert. According to radar analysis, it was over this stretch of land that the Zilitla object had first been sighted, taking its course towards the small town. This area in the incident of 2007 also share connections with that most famous UFO incident in Mexican history, the Chihuahua Desert incident of 1974. The three stories have a few connections. All three involve unexplained activity. The Zone of Silence is less than 200 miles south of the UFO plane crash of 1974. It is believed, based on radar records, that the UFO that crashed in Zilitla had come out of the Zone of Silence, and possibly the UFO that hit the plane may have been heading there. Mexico has had a lot of UFO sightings over the years. Many are seen near that huge volcano that I can't pronounce the name of. You know the one with the long, hard to pronounce name if you don't speak Spanish. If you have a story that you'd like to share, you can send it to me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. It can be your own encounter or something you heard from a family member or friend, as long as it's true. Just as much as you know, just send me the details. I'll put it into a readable form. I'll send you the draft so you can approve it or say, that's not what I said. Then, when I get my book ready, you'll have your story out there in print. We all have a story that is uniquely ours. If we share it with somebody, then they might remember it a few years down the road. Once you got it printed inside a book, once it's on paper in black and white, well, it's pretty much there forever. Just think what would have happened had Stanton Friedman not gotten in contact with Jesse Marcel and gotten that story from him. Roswell would be a defunct old air base today, and they wouldn't have much of a tourist industry. If you haven't been to Roswell, you should go. The place is incredible. The street lights all look like great big alien heads. Just about every store has some kind of an alien theme on it, including the Walmart has a great big crash scene painted on the wall. If you'd like to read what I've already written, you can find my books at the Organic Man Coffee Strike on McPherson. Remember, they're fixing to move. They're moving a whole 50 feet across the parking lot into a bigger building. If you're not in Laredo, you can get my books at Amazon.com. And remember, books make great presents. They don't require batteries. If you drop them, they don't break. They're easy to wrap. And if the person that receives them decides he doesn't want them, they can simply rewrap them and give them to somebody else. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? this ain't murder three. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.